So my paper is going to kind of pull together a number of areas of my research. I'm kind of going to be looking at ideas of Kairos, which leads very nicely from Justin's paper about the nature of time and different concepts of time. I'll be looking at soundscape in prehistory and arguing that actually ambient music is much older than 40 years old. Looking at caves and bone flutes, the evolution of Chillout and ambient dub or ambient house, and in particular looking at two pieces of music called Reverie Dub and Viking Bagpipe Dub, which are going to be performed tomorrow in the concert. So you'll hear the pieces tomorrow, which I regard as practice-based research. So there are a number of things being pulled together here. So ambient music, thought I'd start with this quote. Ambient music is used by individuals within spiritual practice to create narratives of meaning that help them to understand the world and their place in it. And I suppose that's an approach to ambient music that I've chosen to take, in which the inner languaging stops. And as well as the idea that that might happen when people are listening to ambient music, as a composer, I am aiming to stop the inner languaging in myself and in audiences. That's the kind of aim of the music. And in some ways, as practice-based research, that's the point at which the research begins, I think. In that I'm aiming to create a situation where experiences can happen, and the experiences themselves really are what are most interesting to me in terms of research. Lamont Young, who Brian Eno described Lamont Young as the daddy of us all when he was talking about the development of ambient music. Lamont Young, minimalist composer, describes wanting to understand the relationship to universal structure and to time, even in a simpler way as where do we come from, why we're here, and where are we going. Time is really a very important aspect of universal structure. What I have learned is it goes very slowly. So I guess one can see why he's influential to Brian Eno. And this idea of time and manipulation of time is, I think, at the core of what we know today as ambient music. I like Greek language. The Greeks often have more than one word for a concept, where we only have one word, and time is no exception. So the Greeks have a word called Kairos, which means time. So I want to talk a bit about the context of ambient music in a number of ways. So Chronos is what the Greeks call quantitative time, or what I describe as quantitative time. Chronos is time that has amount, so it has seconds, it has minutes. It's time that ticks away. It's time that's kind of regular. So the time on a watch would be Chronos. So we talk about chronometers. But Kairos also is translated in English as time, but is what I call qualitative time. So that's time that has quality, that a moment in time that's special. So when time kind of stops, and you have a moment with other people, when you have those special moments when time seems to exist in a different way. The Greeks actually saw those as different things. They're not both the same thing. They're not both time. If you think that time is one thing, they're suggesting that time can be many things, and there can be many different kinds of time. And it's creating those ideas of Kairos. I find this a useful term because that's that inner languaging stopping. That's the process that I'm kind of interested in. And this seems to happen through entrainment. Entrainment is a term for two systems to be coupled. So a simple one is that we're all entrained to the turning of the earth and of it getting light and getting dark. That's a rhythm, that has a frequency of once per day or whatever. It gets light, it gets dark. We're entrained in that when it gets light, we wake up. Or we tend to wake up. And when it gets dark, we tend to go to sleep. So we're linked to that system. That happens, for example, in clapping. If we start clapping and everyone claps in time, then we're all coupled by kind of cultural expectation, and we can entrain to one another. A number of rhythms can be linked together and put into time. In a lot of music, our bodies can be entrained. So our bodies can be entrained to external rhythm. In a nightclub, if people dance, then everybody is entrained to a single rhythm. And our bodies can be entrained, our minds can be entrained, even heartbeats can be entrained by music or other rhythms. In this kind of musical entrainment, when we link to a musical rhythm, what I suggest is that is a primary way of disconnecting from chronos. Usually I live by my watch. If I have a meeting, my watch or my computer tells me it's time to go to a meeting or give a talk or whatever it might be, and I'm linked, I'm entrained to the day-to-day ticking of the clock. But in music, I'm disconnected from that day-to-day activity. I'm no longer linked to the ticking of the clock. I'm linked to the ticking of a bass drum or a violin part or whatever it might be. And it takes me out of that chronos approach to life, and it allows me to engage with Kairos. And lots of other things can also disconnect us. Silence or darkness or stillness can do that as well. Overloaded stimulation can do the same. If you have so much input, it can also disconnect you. You can be kind of overloaded by loud noises, and that exists in various possession trance rituals, for example. And lots of combinations of these things also work. I'll just show you a quick... I like this, it's my favourite illustration of entrainment. So a number of metronomes are to start with, not synchronised. And they're coupled by the board that they're sat on, being linked together by being freed from the table on a couple of tables. So once they're coupled by having this relationship, the code can't allow them to move and affect each other, they're coupled to one another, very quickly they move in time with one another. They become entrained to one another. A very interesting process, and one that seems key in achieving states of trance, whether possession trance or ecstatic trance or staring out the window trance, sort of daydreaming. And it's a nice quote on entrainment. More generally, several cognitive psychologists hold that perception, attention, and expectation are all rhythmic processes subject to entrainment. In other words, even when a person is only listening to speech or music, their perceptions and expectations will be coordinated by their entrainment to what they hear. Entrainment is fundamental then, not just to coordinate with others, but even to perceive, react to, and enjoy music. Music, as an external oscillator, entraining our internal oscillators, has the potential to affect not only our sense of time, but also our sense of being in the world. So music can disconnect us from the everyday and connect us to other rhythms and also to other people, to culture, and to space and place. And it can take us to states of trance. Originally this had ecstatic trance and possession trance. People think, I've talked about trance to archaeologists before, and they think of it, well, that has to be when you totally lost your mind and you're frothing at the mouth. But I think trance is a continuum from those sort of extreme states of trance where people have a complete loss of sense, loss of memory, to the very light senses of trance where you just drift off for a moment. And it's a continuum from one thing to the other, and you can be at various stages on that. The classic, symptom of trance is that you lose track of time. So in extreme possession trance of some kind, you will have lost 2 hours of your life or whatever and not remember anything about it. But I'm sure you've probably all been listening to music and found that, I didn't realise an hour's gone by, I thought I'd only been here 10 minutes. That's being in a trance. And another term for that would be, a more generic term, is of course altered state of consciousness. It's been a different kind of state of consciousness. So this is something that it appears is very ancient, and the use of music, and not just music, but acoustics and environmental sound, to affect our consciousness seems to be very old. It seems that Brian Eno didn't invent ambient music, just as Columbus did not discover America. Ambient music's always been there. There exists evidence of ambient music as early as prehistory, at least 40,000 years ago. Freeman writes about the origins of music, and he says that social action of music induces new forms of behaviour owing to the malleability that can come due to the altered state. It's reasonable to suppose that musical skills played a major role early in the evolution of human intellect, because they made possible the formation of human societies as a prerequisite for the transmission of acquired knowledge across generations. In other words, music develops alongside technology like fire and building housing for building relationships in community, and actually helps Homo sapiens out-compete Homo neanderthalis. It is something that seems to be quite ancient. So we have evidence of musical culture, for example, as old as 40,000 years ago. This is one of the oldest musical instruments ever found, made by humans, made by people. This is the Geissenklosteler flute from Germany. It's the original archaeological object is 40,000 years old and is carved out of mammoth tusk. This is the Hohlefels bird bone flute. It's not really a flute, it's a pipe. But anyway, it's made out of vulture bone, and vulture bone pipes like this that have been found carved into the shape of musical instruments from 40,000 years ago through to a couple of hundred years ago. These were still being made in Scandinavia to scare off wolves. Often made of bird bone and often made of vulture bone in particular. So we know that people have been making musical instruments for a long time. But I took part in a project that looked at the culture of caves, prehistoric caves with cave paintings in, and looked at their acoustics. People didn't really live in caves in the bottom of caves. Prehistoric people lived in the entrances to caves, otherwise they'd have had to have torches burning all the time to give them light. And the insides of these stages, the deep parts, were alien, strange, dangerous places that they only visited once in a while, and they made paintings there, as you probably know. They were dark, they were unknown, and they were an alien acoustic environment. There were very few other spaces at the time with reverberation. There were no bathrooms, there were no churches, there were no artificial buildings with reverberant spaces. So these caves had this reverberant space and had echoes in it, which were very, very rare things. That sort of acoustic didn't exist anywhere else. Still, people made these journeys into the dark to create paintings. And I was involved in a project with colleagues from Salford and Durham University, which looked at the links between cave art and rituals in caves in prehistory and their soundscape or acoustics. So we went into these caves in Spain, actually, and we recorded where there was artwork, cave art, and we also did acoustic tests where we captured the impulse responses and measured the reverberation time in the caves. And we did some correlation statistical tests, and we showed that where there were cave paintings, there were particular acoustics. In other words, we showed that where these rituals of painting things in caves happened, sound was part of the mix. There's some kind of link between cave painting and sound. So it seems likely that these paintings were part of ritual activity, and it seems likely that the acoustics of the space were consciously involved in that in some way. In other words, this shows evidence that prehistoric people noticed acoustics. When you add to that the fact that in these caves we find these bird flutes, you have this wonderful picture of people making paintings with bird bone flutes, for example, and appreciating the acoustics in the space in order perhaps to call the ancestors. When you find out that these handprints are actually made by taking a tube of bone and blowing through it with another tube of bone in order to suck up the paint, which gets sprayed in a kind of airbrush type technique. When you try that, it makes this amazing gurgling, fluty noise as well. So these things are very much tied up together. So I became interested in the soundscape of these spaces and reflecting them, exploring what the soundscape of these might have been or how it might have felt to be in the caves. And I became interested in creating music, composing music to try and evoke these ideas of entrainment, of soundscape, of prehistory, and also of today. This is just some of the statistical testing we did, Fisher exact tests. In the end, logistic regression analysis. But anyway, enough of that. So what goes on in these caves, and why does it relate to ambient music? Well, interestingly, we've had a paper earlier talking about John Cage's experience in the anechoic chamber. Well, these caves are like anechoic chambers. They're deep underground, there's no wind, in fact there's remarkably little background noise. In fact, we took a very expensive noise meter into the caves, and the reading we got was the same as the self-noise of the machine. In other words, all we got was the noise that the machine's electronics make, until a drop of water fell on it or near it, in which case it kind of exploded with loudness and then went back to quiet. But actually, it's like being in an anechoic chamber. It's very, very quiet. And it can be, when your torch goes out, incredibly dark as well. I mean, I left this cave, I had this astonishing experience when leaving the cave of coming out and hearing this incredibly loud noises when I left the cave, of bees buzzing and birds tweeting and a gentle spring summer breeze blowing in a French countryside. Environmental sounds suddenly seemed very loud. And interestingly, sensory deprivation, lack of light and sound, can cause disorientation. More interestingly, visual hallucinations. After 4 hours in the dark, you start to see things. Because your brain wants to interpret, is desperate to have interpretation. And after only actually 15 to 30 minutes, you start to hear things. You start to actually have audio hallucinations. In other words, it can lead you into a trance-like space in these spaces. So the soundscapes of these places are very powerful, very interesting. And I was interested, I suppose, in relating these soundscapes to contemporary soundscapes, to understand what is common between the prehistoric people of the past and us today. In Becker's work on deep listeners, she says, by enveloping the trancer in a soundscape that suggests, invokes, or represents other times and distant spaces, the transition out of quotidian time and space comes easier. One is moved from the mundane to the supranormal, another realm, another time, which I suppose I wanted a piece of music to explore. So first I wrote a composition for this flute, this pipe. This is a reconstruction, a modern reconstruction of the Historic's bone pipe. And it draws upon all these references and concepts. So this was found by archaeologists in a cave in France called the Historic Cave. It's the most complete prehistoric bone flute found. It's almost complete, so we know that reconstruction is very like it. It was found in France. It's 20,000 years old. But actually there were 30 bone flutes found in that cave, and they date over a period of 15,000 years. So we know we have these 40,000-year-old flutes, and we have kind of 25,000 years of bone flute making, and in this one cave, 15,000 years of making musical instruments. Anyway, I wrote a piece for this instrument for a flautist called Anna Friedrich Potenkowski, who's a contemporary flautist from Germany. It intends to take the performer into entrainment and entrancement, and that my idea was that the flute player would be hyperventilating and would be kind of deliberately drifting off and confused and try to be in this cave-like space. So it begins with no time. I just gave a set of notes with pauses over them in the actual score, and to start with, the performer can kind of choose which notes they play. I'll play the beginning of the piece. This is just played. I wrote the piece as just a solo flute piece, and this is it recorded in the Historic's cave. So this is the Historic's flute played in the Historic's cave, which I thought is important. It sounds a bit like this. So moving on, I did do some stuff with actual notation she had to play, and then moved to a series of fast notes, which were to be played from memory and are deliberately confusing. So these two phrases, this phrase is repeated, but then it's something very similar has to be played, but it's specifically different. So it's very difficult to memorise, almost impossible, and deliberately so. And so there's a section where, from memory, she had to play a range of these phrases, and they also have sort of compound times so that they go across the beat and kind of confuse the sense of time. A short diversion. So how does that fit in with ambient music and chill-out music and electronic music? Well, one of the problems with writing music for reconstructions of ancient instruments is that you cannot make prehistoric music. Our ears are not prehistoric, we're not prehistoric, we don't really know how it would be made, we don't really know what specific notes would have been played on these flutes. There is no prehistoric notation, I'm afraid, sadly. So I'm aware that any piece I wrote would be a construction on a reconstruction. So for this, I decided to create a remix, a version, if you will, or a dub of this piece that I've written for solo flute, using multiple cultures of ecstatic trance, altered states of consciousness, and drawing upon my own experiences of electronic chill-out music. How long have I been talking for? Almost too long, so I'll crack on. So I have a background. I studied originally with Gavin Bryce. I did composition with Gavin Bryce, a composer who was recorded by Brian Eno and worked very closely with Brian Eno. And then years later I did a PhD in ambient electronica and kind of played in chill-out bands. And only much later discovered these sort of overt links between them. But I just wanted to go through those links quickly. And this came out when I wrote a book chapter that came out last year called Ambient Music, which was in the Bloomsbury Handbook of Religion and Popular Music. And I go into a lot more detail in this, but very quickly, Pink Floyd, from the first album comes out in 1967. Their keyboard player, Richard Wright, studied piano and studied Stockhausen. A band called Transmarine Dreams, starting in 1970, were influenced by Pink Floyd. Christopher Franke joined that, or Frank joined the band. He'd studied composition in Berlin, influenced by Cage and Stockhausen. Kraftwerk, many of these bands, as you know, are called Krautrock, which is an irritating and inaccurate term, but anyway. Kraftwerk were influenced by Lamont Young and Terry Riley in particular, as well as by Stockhausen and the Futurists. Another German band, Can. Erwin Schmidt formed Can, and he actually studied with Stockhausen, or worked rather with Stockhausen and Cage in Darmstadt, and Young, Reich and Riley in New York. And in fact, he met one of his bandmates at Darmstadt. And then there's a band called Neu that was formed by ex-members of Kraftwerk. It's a kind of splinter band of Kraftwerk. Now, I mention these bands in the context of this conference because Eno adopted their musical stylings when he produced David Bowie's albums Low and Heroes, which are albums of ambient music before Music for Airport. They really are. And in fact, if you listen to Neu's first album, and Can's first albums from the earlier 70s, from 72, 73, 75, that music sounds very, very similar again. And Eno very much kind of appropriated those musical techniques and those musical styles, I would suggest. So in fact, in many ways, what we know as Brian Eno's ambient music for Music in Airports, it is pretty much the music of Neu and Can in many ways. And they could be regarded as inventing ambient music, except that Eno is the one who names it, who gives it a name, who establishes a genre, and who contextualizes it, who writes essays about it, who theorizes it, and actually makes it into something. I mean, Eric Satie writes ambient music, as do prehistoric people in caves, right? So, in the same way, as I said earlier, as Columbus didn't discover America, ambient music wasn't discovered by Eno, but it was certainly named by him. And he mixed together the music of these German popular music artists with art music influences, such as Bryce, Fripp, Adams, Hobbs, Cage and Riley. And as I've tried to show, there's a strong linkage between all these artists as the pop artists were influenced by Stockhausen, Cage and minimalists. I won't go into detail about the birth of Chillout, but because Justin's just done a much better job of this. But as he said, Alex Patterson worked with Brian Eno and starts to create electronic Chillout in 1985, calling it ambient music, sampling Pink Floyd, and KLF also used the term ambient music. So I have drawn upon, I decided to do a kind of dub mix of this piece, a version of it, but using electronic sounds from the sound world of contemporary electronic chill-out music. So I took the pipe part from Reverie and added synth pads, sequences of which have different kind of length sections, echoes and filters. And you'll hear the whole piece, hopefully on Saturday night, but here's a little bit of it. I'll skip in actually. Time, so I should stop before the pig croaks. In this time is deliberately confused in various ways. There is no, although some regular repeating pulse stuff appears, it's deliberately confused, so it's kind of designed to be atemporal. Whereas the second piece is is based on a Scandinavian bagpipe, a very ancient archaeological find again, and a reconstruction by some Scandinavian music archaeologists. And this seemed to suggest dub effects, so it ended up as a dub reggae feel. So it uses clouds of reverb and delay, which is perhaps simulated cave-like sound. Anyway, I just want to move to conclude. This all kind of fits in, to me, with Jacques Attali's ideas of musical periods, starting with music that's recorded in the body, with oral culture music, moving on to scored music recorded from about 100 years ago, and now in our kind of postmodern deregulated period, recording has become so common that everybody is writing music and we move to a period of composition. And everyone is writing electronic ambient music with their apps or their phones, and computers are doing it for us. But what I feel is that this takes us full circle, that the deregulation of music and the mass composition of music leaves us back into a kind of oral culture where music is of the many, not the few. I'll skip that quote and move to my last one. So Zygmunt Bauman talks about postmodernity bringing re-enchantment of the world after the proactive and earnest, though in the end inconclusive, modern struggle to disenchant it. Dignity has been returned to emotions, legitimacy to the inexplicable, nay, irrational sympathies and loyalties which cannot explain themselves in terms of their usefulness and purpose. Fear of the void has been blunted and assuaged. We learn to live with events and acts that are inexplicable. Some of us would say that it is such events and acts that constitute the hard, irremovable core of the human predicament. And I suppose finally I promote a definition of music that includes space, acoustics, place and context alongside organised sound and silence. And the conclusion of all of this is really, for me, that we have to consider a piece of music performed in one space as a different piece of music when it's performed in another space, and widen our concept of music itself to include context in a much more significant way.